Welcome to this collaborative Baja 4 Sunday worship service. We are the 4 Unitarian Universalist congregations of Southeast Arizona. We are in Amado, in Sierra Vista, and in Tucson. And we gather together because we know we are stronger together than apart, and we need each other now more than ever. We begin each week with an acknowledgement that we are each gathering on stolen land. We gather on tribal or ancestral lands of the Chiricahua Apache, the Pasquayaqui, the O'odham, and the Opata people. We acknowledge this to bring all of our attention to the work to do together, the work of accountability, of healing, and participating in the messy present, in dedication to a more equitable future that challenges ongoing processes of colonization and brings into reality a decolonized world. I have lit our chalice today in honor of that commitment, that there is work to do, that we do not have all of the answers, that we show up honestly to what is not ours to do alone, that we are stronger together than apart, and that we will be faithful and present to the shared task ahead of us. My name is Reverend Samantha Wilson, and I have been away from you all for a couple weeks for vacation and study leave. And during that time, I have undergone a transformation. I have defended my doctoral thesis, and I've completed my PhD in depth community psychology. And I am now the Reverend Dr. Samantha Wilson. Hooray! My doctoral studies are research on the best practices and culture building of white organizations that organize for anti-racism alongside Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. So inevitably, I want to tell you all about it, and I plan on sharing it more with the Baja 4 at some kind of lecture thing in April. But for now, a long-awaited change for me, 6 years in the making, if you would be willing to count from your homes on 3. 1, 2, 3. Yay! Thanks for humoring me. So today's service continues on the topic of taboos and fake fights. What are the things that are hardest to talk about in Unitarian Universalism? How do we fight about them without really talking about the real issue? And what is the real issue anyway that needs our attention? Today, we are discussing the taboo of sacred or religious language. What happens in a congregation when we mention the word God, maybe more than once? And what happens in your body if I were to say Amen or Blessed be at the end of a prayer? What happens if I talk about my spirit, or I ask you about your soul, or I suggest something about the world that is bigger than you or I alone that I don't understand, maybe in a way that brings tears in front of you? In today's service, we begin in recognition that each of us grew up in different religious worlds, and that some of us experienced harm in those religious communities, and those communities used religion as violence. Then, beyond that recognition, there is an invitation in today's service. What happens when Unitarian Universalist communities are afraid to use sacred language or just avoid it entirely? And what does our silence say? What are we missing out on? What's the alternative? So come, let's listen, let's learn, and let's worship together.
I seek the spirit of a child who meets life naturally, the child who sings the world alive and greets the morning sun with glee. Children are real beyond a lot. May I see joy's a gift to our heart.
I seek the freedom of a child who loves instinctively, who lights our day with just a smile and shines that light on all we see. Children are real beyond all fears. May I see hope's a gift to our tears. I seek the wonder of a child who sees delightfully, now clouds in cloud, now golden sun, imaginations true and free. Children are real beyond all lies. May I see faith's a gift to our eyes.
Today, the story I have for you is called The Velveteen Rabbit, originally written by Marjorie Williams Bianco, and this version is illustrated by Charles Santori. There was once a velveteen rabbit. We might call him a Stuffy today. And in the beginning, he was really splendid. He was fat and bunchy as a rabbit should be. His coat was spotted brown and white, and he had real thread for his whiskers, and his ears were lined with pink sateen. On Christmas morning, he sat wedged in the top of the boy's stocking with a sprig of holly between his paws, and the effect was charming. For a long time, he lived in the toy cupboard or on the nursery room floor, and no one thought very much about him. He was naturally shy, and being only made of velveteen, some of the more expensive toys quite snubbed him. Between them all, the poor little rabbit was made to feel himself very insignificant and commonplace, and the only person who was kind to him at all was the skin horse. Now, there was a person who ruled the nursery called Nana. Sometimes she took no notice of the playthings lying about, and sometimes, for no reason whatsoever, she went swooping around like a great wind and hustled them away in the cupboards. This she called tidying up. One evening, when the boy was going to bed, he lost the favorite toy that he always loved to sleep with. Nana was in a hurry, so she didn't trouble to hunt for the little dog the boy had lost, and she swooped in and picked up the rabbit. "Here," she said, "take your old bunny. He'll do to sleep with you." She dragged the rabbit out and put him in the boy's arms. That night, for the first night, for many, many nights, the Velveteen Rabbit slept in the boy's bed. At first, he found it rather uncomfortable, for the boy hugged him very tight, and sometimes he rolled over on him, and sometimes he pushed him so far under the pillow that the rabbit could scarcely breathe. But very soon, he grew to like it, for the boy liked to talk to him and made little burrows under the bedclothes just like real rabbits lived in. They had splendid games together. And spring came, and they had long days in the garden, for wherever the boy went, the rabbit went too. He had rides in the wheelbarrow and picnics on the grass. And once, when the boy was called away suddenly to go out to tea, Rabbit was left out on the lawn until long after dusk. And Nana had to come and look for him with a candle because the boy couldn't go to sleep if he wasn't there. When Nana finally brought Rabbit in to the boy, she said, "You must have all your old bunny," she said. "Fancy all that muss for a toy." The boy sat up and stretched out his arms. "Give me my bunny," he said. "You mustn't say that. He isn't a toy. He is real." And that was a wonderful summer. And as it does, the weeks passed. The little rabbit grew very old and shabby, but the boy loved him just as much. He loved him so hard that he loved all his whiskers off, and the pink lining in his ears turned gray, and his brown spots faded. He even began to lose his shape, and he scarcely looked like a rabbit anymore except to the boy. To him, he was always beautiful, and that was all the little rabbit cared about. Then one day, the boy grew ill. His face was flushed, and he talked in his sleep, and his little body was so hot that it burned the rabbit when he held him close. But still, the rabbit stayed in the bed with the boy because he knew his boy needed him. For a long time, the boy was too ill to play, and the little rabbit found it rather dull with nothing to do all day. But he snuggled down patiently and looked forward to the time when the boy would be well again, and they would go to the garden amongst the flowers and the butterflies and play splendid games. Soon, it was bright and sunny morning, and the windows were wide open. They carried the boy out to the balcony wrapped in a shawl, and the little rabbit lay tangled up among the bedclothes thinking. The boy was going to the seaside tomorrow to finish getting better. Everything was arranged, and the rabbit was beginning to be excited. Just then, Nana caught sight of him. "How about this old bunny?" she asked. "That?" said the doctor who was in the room. "Why, that's a mass of scarlet fever germs. Burn it at once. What nonsense. Get him a new one. He mustn't have that anymore." And so the little rabbit was put into a sack with the old picture books and a lot of rubbish and carried out to the end of the garden behind the fowl house. That was a fine place to make a bonfire, only the gardener was too busy just then to attend to it. That night, the boy slept in a different bedroom, and he had a shiny new bunny to sleep with. And while the boy was asleep, dreaming of the seaside, the little rabbit lay amongst the old picture books in the corner of the fowl house, and he felt very lonely. The sack had been left untied, and so by wriggling out of it a bit, he was able to get his head through the opening and look out. He was shivering a little, for he had always been used to sleeping in a proper bed, and by this time his coat was worn so thin and threadbare from hugging, it no longer had any protection for him. Nearby, he could see the thicket of raspberry canes where he and the boy liked to play. He thought of those long sunlit hours in the garden and how happy they were, and a great sadness came over him. He seemed to see them all pass before him, each more beautiful than the other: the fairy huts in the flower bed, the quiet evening in the woods where he lay in the bracken, and the little ants running over his paws, the wonderful day when he first knew that he was real. He thought of the skin horse, so wise and gentle, and all that he had told him. Of what use was it to be loved and lose one's beauty and become real if it all ended like this? And a tear, a real tear, trickled down his shabby velvet nose and fell to the ground. But then a strange thing happened. For where the tear had fallen, a flower grew out of the ground, a mysterious flower. Presently, the blossom opened, and out stepped a fairy. She was quite the loveliest fairy in the whole world. And she came close to the little rabbit and gathered him in her arms and kissed him on his little velveteen nose that was all damp from crying. "Little rabbit," she said, "don't you know who I am?" The rabbit looked up at her. It had seemed to him that he'd seen her face before, but he couldn't think where. "I am the nursery magic fairy," she said. "I take care of all the playthings that children have loved. And when they are old and worn out and the children don't need them anymore, I come and take them away with me, and I turn them into real." "Wasn't I real before?" said the little bunny. "You were real to the boy," the fairy said, "because he loved you. Now you shall be real to everyone." She held the little rabbit close in her arms and flew with him into the wood. It was light now, for the moon had risen. All the forest was beautiful. In the open glade between the tree trunks, the wild rabbits danced with their shadows in the velvet grass. But when they saw the fairy, they all stopped dancing and stood round in a ring to glare at her. "I brought you a new playfellow," the fairy said. "You must be very kind to him and teach him all he needs to know in Rabbitland, for he's going to live with you forever and ever." And she kissed the little rabbit and put him in the grass. "Run and play, little rabbit," she said. But the little rabbit sat quite still for a moment and never moved. For when he saw all the wild rabbits dancing around him, he suddenly remembered about his hind legs. He didn't want them to see that he was made all in one piece and didn't have hind legs. He did not know that when the fairy kissed him that last time, she changed him altogether. And he might have sat there a long time, too shy to move, if just then something hadn't tickled his nose. And before he thought about what he was doing, he lifted his hind toe to scratch it. And he found he actually had hind legs. Instead of dingy velveteen, he had soft brown fur. His ears twitched by themselves, and his whiskers were so long they brushed the grass. He gave one leap, and the joy of using those hind legs was so great. He went springing about the turf on them, jumping sideways and whirling around as the others did. He grew so excited that when at last he did stop to look for the fairy, she had gone. He was a real rabbit, at last, at home with the other rabbits.
When I was a boy each week, Sunday we would go to church and pay attention to the priest. He would read the holy word and concentrate the holy bread. And everyone would kneel and bow. The day, the only difference. Everything is holy now. Everything is holy now. When I was in Sunday school, we would learn about the time Moses split the sea in two. Jesus made the water wine. And I remember feeling sad. Miracles don't happen still. Now I can't keep track, 'cause everything's a miracle. Everything's a miracle. Wine from water is not so small, but an even better magic trick is that anything is here at all. So the challenging thing becomes, not to look for miracles, but finding where there isn't one. When holy water was rare at best, it barely wet my fingertips. But now I have to hold my breath, like I'm swimming in a sea of it. Used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down. But I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now. Read a questioning child's face and say it's not a testament. Well, that'd be very hard to say. See another new morning come and say it's not a sacrament. I tell you that it can't be done. This morning outside I stood and saw a little red-winged bird shining like a burning bush, singing like a scripture verse. Made me want to bow my head. I remember when church laid out how things have changed since then. Everything is holy now. Used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down. But I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now.
Bigger than the fight you had with your sister and your aches and pains, bigger even than your whole being, yourself who is part of and trapped within and blessed by a body that does what you want and doesn't do what you want, and wants all the wrong things and wants all the right things. You stand at the edge of mystery, at the edge of the deep, with the light streaming at you, and you can't hide anything, not even from yourself, when you stand there like that. And then, what? Maybe you call your pastor and say, "What is this? What do I do?" And your pastor comes and stands at the edge with you and looks over. She can't hide anything either, she thinks. Not even the fact that she doesn't have the answer to your question, and she wonders if you can tell. She thinks of all the generations who've come there before you and cast words out towards the source of that light, wanting to name it. Somehow, she thinks to herself, the names stay tethered to the aging world and get old, while the light remains timeless and burns without dimming. Meanwhile, the armful of worries you brought to the edge of mystery have fluttered to your feet. Unobscured by these, you shine back, light emanating light. You with your broken heart and your seeking, you, are the utterance of the timeless word. The name of the holy is pronounced through your being.
I had the great pleasure once of singing in a choir led by Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout, who is the worship arts director at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor, Michigan. You've seen him in some of our worship services before, and we will hear a poem from him later. And Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout gave us an invitation in one of the songs we were singing. The lyrics that we all had in front of us instructed, maybe told us to say the word walk. And Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout invited us to create a murmur, a layering of different words for the different ways that beings move when the word walk appeared in the lyrics. And it was really cool and fun to hear what we did with that. It was just an auditory murmur when we got to that word in the song we were singing. And I think we can apply this murmuration to sacred language too. If, for instance, when another person says God, other people say love, goddess, community, science, etc., there would be an auditory murmuration. And I think this murmur would appropriately encapsulate the breadth of Unitarian Universalism, the breadth of who we are. In this next song, Nada Te Turbe, you will hear the word Dios with a capital D, which, as many of you know, is the Spanish word for God, the sacred, the divine. And as you hear that word Dios, you will see a visual murmuration, different words that you or another might say when someone says Dios or God. This visual murmur is an invitation to imagine your names, your words for the sacred, the divine, that which is bigger than yourself. And it's an invitation to bring those words, those names, into the space you are in, the space we are creating together.
I love language. I love language. And when I was preparing for the service, I did too much reading and research about studies about language and being bilingual and multilingual. And unfortunately, you will have to suffer some of the highlights. Here they are. 1. Research suggests that more than half, 60 to 70% of this world, speak more than one language. Being monolingual, or only speaking one language, is not the norm. And other research looks at multilingualism as a historical norm, that actually being monolingual was the taboo for quite some time, and that there was incredible value between communities for people speaking different languages. And that in some communities, when you move through time and space, say you cross a stream into another person's community, you would automatically start switching and speaking a different language because of the place you were walking on and in. Now, in the United States, we've inherited a politics of language, of course. We're familiar with English-only movements, especially those of us down here in southern Arizona. But that is an old lineage of forcing monolingualism. That comes from the 1700s with Benjamin Franklin being freaked out about German language taking over English languages. And that was in the early 1900s with Theodore Roosevelt saying that there was only one room for one language in our country, and that would be English. And that carried all the way to 2016, as we all know, with a former president who once said, "This is a country where we speak English. It's English. You have to speak English." Now, of course, none of that had to do with language. That had to do with shaping reality and domination and control. Because language does shape our realities. We know that psychologically. There are so many other studies that focus on how a person changes depending on how they're speaking and in what language they're speaking. There are studies of bilingual people who tell the same story differently depending on what language they're in and feel differently about themselves when they tell it. And there's another study about bilingual people who are given the same test in 2 different countries, Germany and an English-speaking country. And it doesn't matter which language they're speaking in which country, they'll take it differently because of the country they're in. And then there's also studies about how developing a second language in your life actually changes your brain. It actually shows that you're able to experience the world and be in relationship to the world, solve problems, interact differently because you can think in another language. So languages, by and large, they shape who we are and how we are and what we understand about the world. Language is a doorway that can expand our sense of ourselves and our relationships. So what does it mean if there are entire words, entire languages that we refuse to use? Now, the Reverend Dr. Kendall Gibbons is a Unitarian Universalist minister who gave a General Assembly sermon about the need for Unitarian Universalists to develop a language of reverence. Now, reverence is the word she chose. It's that reverential, awe-inspired, inexplicable experience that is common across all people, whether you're humanist or atheist or pagan or Buddhist or Jewish or Christian. You can have a human experience of reverence and awe. She described growing up in a humanist family and feeling more comfortable, partly because of Unitarian Universalism, talking about sex rather than talking about religion. And I feel her. I also grew up in Unitarian Universalism. And I can tell you in high school and college, I could tell you nature inspired me and that the cosmos was incredible. And I could tell you that Thoreau was awesome. And I could say that the human experience was scripture. But what I did not have was adults, people around me that were comfortable with any other languages of reverence. I didn't hear people share in depth with me about the meaning that they were making of the indescribable and what moved them to tears and what they called it. And I didn't hear people grappling heart forward with each other, with what words meant to them, translating and interpreting God or goddess or divine or holy or the way or sacred. I did hear jokes about how we didn't use those words, and I did hear silences when we refused to use them, and I did hear them in passing, like when you sing a hymn really fast, but you don't talk about the words that were in it. And what I felt, what gets communicated in the silence, in the jokes, and in the passing is a hollowness. Now, I remember respecting and celebrating adults whom in their childhoods had to sit quietly through religious experiences that felt hollow and words that didn't resonate with them. And I could see that they celebrated their freedom. But unfortunately, the silence left me as a child feeling hollow. And when I knew I wanted to go to seminary, I decided to choose a Christian one, a liberal Methodist seminary in Southern California, where suddenly I was sitting alongside other people who knew what their words meant to them. And they didn't mean all the same thing. To be in a classroom of Christian students meant 25 different versions of Christianity, but they used words and they appreciated them. And suddenly, they were looking to me to speak. What did I find reverential? And I fell silent. My jokes and my fumbling that would have been endearing and relatable in a Unitarian Universalist community felt so empty when people around me were asking me to tell them about what inspired me most, and I didn't have the tongue to speak to them. So why aren't we comfortable with languages of reverence? Well, of course, as Tina shared, some of us have been seriously hurt. Some of us were told with these very words that we were not worthy and that we had no inherent worth or dignity. And some of us are uncomfortable with the idea that what moves us or inspires us and the words we use to describe it are just so not rational. They're evocative and they're poetic and they're mysterious and they're felt, and sometimes they're just plain vulnerable. And I also think that we're just uncomfortable when we're learning a new language. Like any of the languages I've half-heartedly or wholeheartedly studied, besides English, man, I just feel fumbling. I feel out of control. I don't feel like an expert. I feel like it must be clear to everyone else that I have no sense of what I'm talking about. And when someone asks you about what matters to you and you don't know how to say it, the feeling is just really vulnerable. So what is the option? Do we abandon all languages of reverence because of some of the ways they were used as violence? Do we come up with something entirely new, trying to find something that we would all possibly agree on? And Reverend Dr. Kendall suggests that the option of abandoning our languages of reverence isn't really an option. For one, to abandon all those different languages completely could suggest that we think we know better than every other human being who has ever tried to describe the indescribable. We become less connected to the lineage of people who have come before us when we deny all of the fruits of their labors about reverence. And yes, the opportunity is that as we practice languages of reverence, new languages emerge among us and between us that then elucidate more about this thing that is so hard to describe. But that if we refuse to describe it, if we joke about our freedom to ignore it, that in the silence all we communicate is our fear and our emptiness. So what's the task at hand? The task at hand is to become less afraid. How do you become less afraid? You become less afraid by drawing closer to the very thing you think is worthy of your fear. So we have a task as a covenantal community that we don't draw towards things we're afraid of alone. We draw to them together. You don't have to go alone. And our individual task in this work is to begin learning our own tongue, to learn our own languages of reverence. What words do you use? What words might you risk using to describe the indescribable? And part of that childhood task is to acknowledge the childhood wounds, the wounds inflicted by religious language that caused harm, and tending our wounds. It's good to heal what hurts. You're worth all the healing in the world, and you don't have to do it alone. When we heal by attending to and caring for the part of us that got hurt, what we can reclaim is our childhood ability to learn, to love learning. And if we can do that, then we get to do another collective task, and that's to invite the words out of each other. We have to invite language from one another, to risk being vulnerable and not in control and not able to explain it all, and to feel awkward, even with the words we've pushed away, with the words we've othered, and maybe even with the words that have caused some harm to us. The opportunity is this. If we embrace our multilingualism inherent in our pluralistic theology and our multiple religious communities, then we have the opportunity to become fuller and wider people. May we be so bold, so audacious, and so willing to learn.
God is no noun, and certainly not an adjective.
God is at least a verb, and even that shrinks her.
God is not so much a woman as she resides in the improbable hope of brown mothers.
God is not so much a man as he is at work in the memory of my grandfather's laugh.
God is not trans. God swims in the tears of the one who sees her real self at long last in the bathroom mirror.
God is not black, neither is he white. God is wading in the contradiction of songs from slave shacks. And I have seen God in the alabaster smiles of children at play.
We're getting Michelangelo all wrong. God is not the bearded one surrounded by angels floating over the Sistine. He is not Adam with his muscled back pressing the earth. No. God is the closing inch of space between their reaching fingers.
Don't believe for a moment that God is Catholic. For God's sake, he isn't even human.
Have you heard the wood thrush when the sun glistens the Huron? Can you see the flowers, how they speak to bees without a word?
Still, God is no spring blossom, no wood thrush.
God is neither the sun nor the bee.
God is what you see in the blossom.
God is when you hear the river and suddenly discover how much of it is part of you. To be clear, God is not you. God is somewhere in the 14 billion years which have come to mean that you are.
God is, after all, at least a verb. She is neither Pharaoh's rod nor Moses' staff. We must be the ones to cease our slavery. She is not interested in blame, neither does she offer praise. Truth, gratitude are ours to breathe.
She will not have your answers. She is too large for answers. She dances too wildly to be fastened to them, and answers are nouns anyway.
God is at least a verb, twirling in the radiant reds of spring blossoms, singing in the rare silences between rapid opinions, attending the tears of dark-skinned deaths, learning in tiny alabaster smiles.
God is waiting in the space between fingers that might connect. He is waiting for us to stop naming her.
She is waiting for us to see all of him.
God
God
is waiting
to
to
be
be unshrunk.
This morning outside I stood, saw a little red-winged bird shining like a burning bush, singing like a scripture verse. Made me wanna bow my head. I remember when church that hour, how things have changed since then. Everything is holy now. I extinguished this flame, but never the truth, even with the distance this pandemic has created among us. The truth that in heart and in mind, in spirit and in the flesh, everything is holy.